The Bitterroot Valley of western Montana Territory in the autumn of 1887 was a country that punished the unprepared with a patience that resembled indifference. The mountains rose on both sides of the valley floor like the walls of a corridor that funneled cold air southward from the Continental Divide, and by mid-October the mornings carried a rawness that went beyond temperature, a quality of stillness in the air that any settler who had survived more than one winter recognized as the land clearing its throat before it began to speak in earnest. The cottonwoods along the river had turned and were dropping their leaves in slow, spiraling falls that collected in drifts against every fence post and foundation wall, and the sky had taken on that pale, flat pewter luminosity that would not lift again until April. The elk had already moved down from the high country. The ground squirrels had already disappeared. Everything that understood winter was behaving accordingly, which made it all the more conspicuous when a human being appeared to be doing something that no one who understood winter would do. The woman working on the south wall of a cabin 3 miles above the village of Darby in the first week of October was doing something that the people who passed on the valley road could see clearly but could not immediately explain. She was attaching bark to the outside of her cabin, not replacing damaged sections of log, not patching gaps. She was layering bark, wide, rough slabs of ponderosa pine bark, each piece 18 to 24 inches across and perhaps an inch thick at the center, over the existing log walls of a cabin that appeared, from any reasonable assessment, to already be a finished structure. She was working methodically from the bottom of the wall upward, overlapping each piece over the one below it the way a person shingles a roof. And she had been doing this for 3 days already, and the south wall was nearly complete, and the effect was striking enough that people were slowing their horses to look. The cabin, which had been a clean and well-built 2-room log structure when Elias Hartwell had raised it in 1882, was beginning to look as if the forest were slowly reclaiming it, as if the trees were growing back over the walls, swallowing the structure in a skin of rough, furrowed, reddish-brown bark that made it look less like a home and more like something that had been abandoned for a decade and left to the weather and the woods. The woman's name was Cora Nyland. She was 29 years old. She had been a widow since March of that year, when her husband Elias, the man who had built the cabin, who had cleared the 40 acres around it, who had dug the well and split the fence rails and done all of the visible, structural, respectable work that a homestead requires, had died of pneumonia 6 days after falling through river ice while crossing the Bitterroot on horseback in a late-season thaw. He had been 34. They had been married for 5 years. They had 2 children, a boy named Peter, who was 4, and a girl named Aylin, who had just turned 2. And now Cora was alone with them on a mountainside, above a valley full of people who had known Elias better than they knew her, and who were watching her cover his cabin in bark with expressions that ranged from puzzlement to concern to something approaching alarm. The first person to say something directly was Orin Tate. Orin Tate was 41 years old and had been building cabins and outbuildings in the Bitterroot Valley since 1878. He was not the only man in the county who could frame a structure and hang a door, but he was the one people sent for when the work needed to be right, and his opinion on matters of construction carried the particular weight that belongs to a man whose buildings are still standing after a decade of Montana winters. He was lean and quiet and precise in his speech, and he came to Cora Nyland's cabin on the 4th day of her work because he had heard about it from 2 different people, and because what they described sounded to him like a woman who was damaging a sound structure out of grief or confusion or some impulse he could not yet name, but felt he should probably address before more harm was done. He arrived in the late morning and stood at the tree line for a few minutes, watching. Cora was on the east wall now, working from a rough scaffold she had built from 2 sawhorses and a pair of planks. She had a bucket of cut-iron nails on the scaffold beside her and a pile of prepared bark slabs leaning against the wall below. She was working with a steadiness that did not look confused. Each piece of bark was placed with care, the bottom edge overlapping the top edge of the piece below it by at least 3 inches, the sides butted close but not forced, the nails driven through at angles that pinned the bark flat against the log wall beneath without splitting the bark itself. Whatever she was doing it with a method that had been thought through. Orin walked into the yard and stood below the scaffold and looked up at her. She looked down at him. He asked her, in the direct way of a man who builds things and does not see the purpose of approaching a structural question sideways, what she was doing to Elias's cabin. She said she was insulating it. He looked at the bark. He looked at the wall. He said that the cabin was already chinked and daubed, and that the logs were 12 inches through, and that there was nothing wrong with the insulation Elias had built. He said the bark would hold moisture against the logs and rot them from the outside in. He said it would harbor insects. He said it would make the cabin look... And here he paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who did not want to be unkind to a widow, like something that had been given up on. He said that if she was worried about the cold, the right answer was more chinking, tighter window frames, and a better fitted door, not covering the whole structure in tree bark like some kind of brush pile. Cora listened to all of this. She was still holding a piece of bark in her left hand and a hammer in her right. When he finished, she said something that Orin Tate would repeat, in various tellings, for years afterward. She said, "The air between the bark and the wall is what keeps us warm. Not the bark. The air." She turned back to her work. Orin stood in the yard for another moment, then walked back to the road, shaking his head in the slow, measured way of a man who has said what he could say and been answered with something he does not yet have a response to. By the end of that week, the story of Cora Nyland's cabin had become one of the reliable topics of conversation at Hendrickson's store in Darby. The details were consistent, because the cabin was visible from the valley road, and anyone who passed could see for themselves what was happening. The widow Nyland was covering every wall of her cabin in bark, bottom to top, the way you'd shingle a roof, and the result was a structure that looked increasingly like it belonged to no one, wild, rough, half swallowed by the forest it sat in. Someone called it the bark house, and the name settled immediately because it was so precisely descriptive that no other name could compete with it. Children pointed at it from passing wagons. Women mentioned it at the church social with the particular tone reserved for situations where concern and entertainment have not yet been sorted from each other. Men who built things shook their heads. The bark house. Cora Nyland's bark house. As if she had forgotten what civilization looked like, or had decided she no longer needed it. What made the mockery worse, what gave it its particular sting, was that it was not malicious. No one in the valley wished Cora Nyland harm. The women who mentioned the bark house at the church social were the same women who had brought food to her door after Elias died. The men who shook their heads at Hendrickson's were the same men who had helped her bring in her hay that first summer alone. The concern was genuine. And genuine concern, when it is wrong, is harder to bear than contempt, because you cannot dismiss it. You cannot harden yourself against people who are trying to help you by telling you that what you are doing is a mistake. You can only continue working and wait for the season to answer on your behalf. There was a particular conversation at the church social in the third week of October that Cora heard about afterward from a neighbor who had the grace to be embarrassed by it. A woman named Agnes Lindstrom, whose husband Niels ran a respectable timber operation south of Darby, had said, with the particular authority of a woman who had raised 5 children through Montana winters, that what the widow Nyland needed was not a barn full of bark, but a man who could cut wood and manage a homestead properly, and that covering a cabin in tree bark was precisely the sort of thing that happened when a woman was left alone too long with too much grief and not enough practical guidance. This was said with sympathy. It was said with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never had reason to question the way things had always been done. And it was repeated to Cora by a neighbor who thought she should know what was being said. And Cora listened and nodded, and went back to her scaffold and continued nailing bark to the north wall, which was the last wall to be completed and the most important, because the north wall faced the prevailing wind and was where the cabin lost the most heat. She finished the north wall on the 29th of October, 1887. The entire cabin was now wrapped. Every log surface was covered. The windows and door frames stood out from the bark like eyes in a face made of forest. And the overall effect was exactly what the valley had been describing. Wild, strange, almost alive, as if the cabin had been built by someone who did not distinguish between shelter and landscape. From 50 yards away, in the gray light of an October afternoon, the bark house looked like something that had grown rather than been built. It looked like it belonged to the mountain rather than to the woman who lived in it. And this was precisely the quality that made the neighbors uneasy, and that would, within 3 months, make them reconsider everything they thought they knew about what a cabin was supposed to look like. What none of them understood, what Cora herself did not attempt to explain, because she had learned already that explanation without demonstration is a form of argument. And argument was not what her children needed from her that autumn, was what she knew about dead air. She had learned it from her father, a man named Henrik Nyland, who had emigrated from the Trøndelag region of central Norway in 1861 and had spent his first American decade working as a carpenter and builder in the Norwegian settlements of eastern Wisconsin before moving his family west to Montana in 1876. Henrik Nyland had built 17 houses in Wisconsin and 4 in Montana, and every one of them had been built with an understanding of cold weather construction that he had carried from Norway the way other men carried tools, not as a possession, but as a way of seeing. He had died in 1885, 2 years before Elias, and Cora had been his only child, and he had taught her everything he knew about why buildings fail in winter, because he believed that knowledge should not die with the person who held it, and because she was the only person who had ever asked him the right questions. The central principle her father had taught her was this: a log wall, no matter how thick, no matter how tightly chinked, is a conductor. Wood conducts heat. Slowly, yes, more slowly than stone, much more slowly than metal, but continuously, inevitably, all winter long. A 12-inch log wall does not stop heat from leaving a cabin. It slows it down. And the difference between slowing heat loss and stopping it is the difference between a cabin that is expensive to keep warm and a cabin that is cheap to keep warm, and in a Montana winter, that difference could be measured in cords of firewood and in hours of sleep lost to feeding a fire that should not have needed feeding. What stops heat loss is not mass. It is air. Specifically, trapped air, air that cannot move, that sits in a sealed space and acts not as a fluid, but as a barrier. A single inch of still, trapped air insulates more effectively than 6 inches of solid wood. This was not a theory Henrik Nyland had invented. It was a principle that Norwegian builders in the coldest regions had understood for generations, and they had applied it in various ways: double walls with air gaps, straw-packed cavities, layered construction that created pockets of stillness between the interior and the exterior. The principle was always the same: create a space where air is held motionless, and that space becomes a wall that heat cannot easily cross. What Cora was building with her overlapping bark shingles was exactly this. Each slab of bark, nailed to the exterior of the log wall with a slight gap maintained by the natural irregularity of both surfaces, created a pocket of trapped air between the bark and the log. The bark itself was not the insulation. The bark was the container for the insulation. The air, still enclosed, sealed between the bark's inner surface and the log's outer surface, was doing the work. And because the bark was overlapped like shingles, rain and snow would run down the exterior surface without penetrating to the air gap beneath, which meant the trapped air stayed dry. And dry, still air is the most effective insulator available to a person working with natural materials on a mountainside in Montana in 1887. The principle was simple. The execution required care. Each piece of bark had to be thick enough to hold its shape against wind and snow load. Ponderosa pine bark, which grows in thick jigsaw puzzle-like plates on mature trees, was ideal for this, and Cora had spent the summer collecting it from deadfall and wind-thrown trees on the slopes above her property, stacking it in her barn to cure. Each piece had to be placed with the natural curve of the bark facing outward, so that the concavity created the air gap against the flat log wall. The overlap had to be sufficient to shed water, but not so tight that it compressed the airspace. The nails had to be driven at angles that held the bark firm without cracking it. Every detail served the principle, and the principle served the children sleeping in the back room of the cabin in January. The first real test came on the 19th of November, when a storm system dropped out of Canada and pushed temperatures in the Bitterroot Valley to 11 degrees below zero, the coldest November night anyone in the county could remember. The cold held for 4 days. Firewood consumption across the valley doubled and then tripled as families fed their stoves through the night and woke to cabins that had cooled despite their efforts, the heat bleeding through log walls and out through roofs and around window frames, with the steady, patient insistence of water finding its way downhill. At Cora Nyland's cabin, the bark house, the wild-looking structure that the valley had been watching with amused concern for 6 weeks, something different was happening. Cora was burning less wood than she had burned in October. Not more, less. The cabin, wrapped in its strange skin of overlapping bark, was holding heat the way a well-made coat holds warmth against a body, not by generating anything, but by refusing to let go of what was already there. The stove that Elias had installed, a good cast-iron box stove with a 6-inch flue, had always been adequate for the cabin's size, but in previous winters it had been adequate the way a cup is adequate for bailing a leaking boat. It worked, but only if you never stopped working it. Now the stove was doing something it had never done before. It was getting ahead. Cora would bank the fire at 9 in the evening, the way she always had, and when she woke at 5, the cabin was still warm, not merely not frozen, but warm, residually, stubbornly warm, as if the air inside the cabin had thickened somehow and was reluctant to move. The children noticed before anyone else did. Peter, who was 4 and had already developed the instinct of a child raised in a cold house to stay under blankets until the fire was rebuilt, began getting out of bed on his own in the mornings. Aylin, who was 2 and could not have articulated what had changed, simply stopped crying when she woke. These were small observations, domestic and unmeasurable, but they were the observations that mattered, and Cora noted them with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent 6 months building something for exactly this purpose. By mid-December, the valley had settled into the deep pattern of a Montana winter, days of bitter cold, broken by brief moderations that felt warm only in comparison, nights that stretched 14 hours and required fire management that bordered on a second occupation. The families who were managing well were burning through their wood piles at a predictable rate. The families who were not managing well were beginning the quiet, humiliating calculations of whether they had enough to last until March. Niels Lindstrom, whose wife Agnes had spoken so confidently about what the widow Nyland needed, had already sent 2 of his timber crew to cut emergency reserves from the slopes above his property, a task that cost him labor he needed elsewhere, and reminded him, if he had been paying attention, that the conventional approach to winter had its own vulnerabilities that no one discussed because everyone shared them. Orin Tate's own cabin, despite its careful construction, was losing heat through its walls at a rate that required him to rise twice each night to feed the stove, and his wife had taken to sleeping in her coat in the weeks after Christmas, because the back room cooled faster than the front room and the fire could not serve both equally. And Cora Nyland, in her bark-covered cabin on the ridge above Darby, was burning through her woodpile at roughly half the rate of any comparable cabin in the valley. This fact became known, not because Cora announced it, but because the woodpile was visible from the road. People who had been watching the bark house all autumn were still watching it through winter, and what they were watching now was a woodpile that was not shrinking the way woodpiles shrink. It sat against the east wall of the barn, neatly stacked, and by Christmas it was still more than 2/3 of what it had been in November, and this was a fact that did not require technical knowledge to interpret. Either Cora Nyland was not heating her cabin, which, given the children, was unthinkable, or the cabin was not losing heat the way every other cabin in the valley was losing it. There was no third explanation. Orin Tate came back in the second week of January. He did not come because he was curious, though he was. He came because his own cabin, a well-built, tightly chinked 14-inch log structure that he had constructed himself in 1879 and had maintained meticulously for 8 years, had consumed more firewood by mid-January than he had projected for the entire winter, and he was facing the prospect of emergency cutting in February, which was dangerous and exhausting, and which he had not had to do since his second year in the valley. He was not a man who revisited his positions easily, but he was a man who respected evidence, and the evidence was standing in Cora Nyland's woodpile, plainly visible from the road, contradicting everything he had said to her in October. He knocked on her door in the late afternoon. When she opened it, The warmth that came through the doorway was the first thing he registered, not the sight of the cabin interior, not the children playing on the floor, but the warmth, immediate and striking, the warmth of a cabin that was holding its heat with a completeness that his own cabin, for all its careful construction, had never achieved. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped inside, and he looked at the walls, the interior walls which were unchanged, the same peeled logs Elias had raised, and then he went back outside and looked at the exterior walls, the bark-shingled exterior that had made the valley shake its collective head for 3 months, and he pressed his hand flat against the bark surface and held it there. The bark was cold, which was correct. If the bark had been warm, it would have meant heat was passing through. The bark was cold because the heat was staying inside, stopped by the inch of still air between the bark and the log, trapped and held and doing exactly what Cora had said it would do on the day he had told her she was making a mistake. He came back inside. He sat at the table. He accepted a cup of coffee, which Cora poured without ceremony. Pater was building something with kindling scraps on the floor. Aylin was asleep on the bed in the back room with the door open, which meant the back room was warm enough to sleep in without the door closed, a detail that Orin noticed because in his own cabin, the back room door stayed closed from November to March, and his children slept under 3 blankets each. He looked at the stove. It was ticking quietly, not roaring, not being fed, just ticking with the residual heat of a fire that had been banked an hour ago and was in no danger of going out because the cabin was not pulling heat from it fast enough to overwhelm it. He said, "I told you the bark would rot your logs," Cora said. "The bark sheds the water. The logs stay dry. Drier than they were before." He looked at her. He had built cabins for 9 years in this valley, and he had never once considered that an exterior cladding could protect logs from moisture rather than trapping it against them, and the simplicity of what she was saying, that overlapping bark sheds rain the same way overlapping shingles shed rain, that water runs down the outside while the inside stays dry, was so obvious once stated that he felt the particular discomfort of a man realizing he had dismissed an idea without thinking it through. The bark was not pressed flat against the logs. It was standing off from them, curved outward, and the space between was dry. He had assumed moisture. There was none. He had assumed rot. The logs beneath the bark were in better condition than logs on cabins half their age, because they were sheltered from the direct assault of rain and snow and freeze-thaw cycles that aged exposed timber faster than anything else in a Montana winter. He sat with this. He drank his coffee. He looked at the children and at the stove, and at the door to the back room, standing open in January. Then he asked her a question that contained, in its asking, the full weight of a man changing his mind. He asked her how thick the air gap needed to be. She told him. She told him everything, the bark selection, the overlap spacing, the nail angles, the way the natural curve of the ponderosa bark created the gap without any shimming or framing required. She told him what her father had told her about dead air, about trapped stillness, about the difference between slowing heat and stopping it. She spoke in the same quiet, unhurried way she had spoken the first time he came, except now he was listening differently, and the difference was the difference between hearing words and understanding what they meant. Orin Tate left Cora Nyland's cabin in the late afternoon of that January day, and what he did over the following weeks was something that only a man with his particular standing in the community could have done. He did not merely adopt the method, he explained it. He went to Hendrickson's store, and he told the men gathered there what he had seen and what he had felt, the warmth of the cabin, the cold of the exterior bark, the woodpile still 2/3 full in the middle of January. And he told them in the language of a builder, in terms of conduction and air gaps and moisture management, and because it was Orin Tate saying it, the men listened in a way they would not have listened if Cora had said the same words herself. He described pressing his hand against the bark and finding it cold, and then stepping inside and feeling the warmth come through the doorway like walking into a kitchen from a frozen yard. And the men at Hendrickson's were quiet in the particular way that a group of practical people are quiet when a piece of information arrives that rearranges something they thought they had settled. Agnes Lindstrom's husband, Niels, was in the store that day. He did not speak. He listened to Orin Tate describe the bark house, and he thought about the two crew members he had pulled from productive work to cut emergency firewood, and he thought about his wife sleeping in her coat. And he said nothing, but he rode past Cora Nyland's cabin on the way home that evening, and he slowed his horse, and he looked at the bark-covered walls with different eyes than he had looked at them with in October. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something about how knowledge travels through communities that is not comfortable but is true. Cora Nyland had the knowledge. She had applied it correctly. She had demonstrated it through an entire winter in plain view of the entire valley. But it was Orin Tate's endorsement, the conversion of the most respected builder in the county from skeptic to advocate, that made the knowledge move. The bark house had been a curiosity. Orin Tate's admission at the trading post made it a precedent. If you have been following this story from the beginning, if you have been sitting with what Cora was building and why, and with what Orin Tate was slowly coming to understand, then you already know what happened next. But stay with it, because the way it happened matters as much as the fact that it did. By late February, two families had approached Cora directly to ask about the method. By March, when the worst of the winter had broken and the valley was beginning the long, slow exhale of early spring, two more had committed to applying bark shingling to their own cabins before the following autumn. By the time the snow retreated above the 5,000-foot line and the first green appeared along the river, four families in the Bitterroot Valley had plans to shingle their cabins in bark. Four families who had spent the winter watching a woodpile that refused to shrink and a cabin that refused to freeze, and children who refused to stay in bed because the floor was too cold, and who had decided, independently, that what the bark house looked like from the road mattered considerably less than what it felt like from inside. Orin Tate was the first to complete his own version. He finished in September of 1888, 3 weeks before the first frost, and he used not ponderosa bark, but the thicker, more fibrous bark of Douglas fir, which was more abundant on his property and which he found created an even more effective air gap due to its deeper furrows. He told Cora about this modification, and she said her father would have approved, and this was the highest praise she knew how to give, and Orin understood it as such. The other three families completed their own bark shingling by mid-October of that year, and by the second winter there were 5 bark houses in the Bitterroot Valley, 5 cabins that looked, from the road, like the forest was slowly swallowing them, and that felt, from inside, like the forest was slowly protecting them. The bark house on the ridge above Darby stood for more than 30 years after that first winter. The bark was replaced in sections as it aged. Every 8 to 10 years, a section would need re-shingling as the oldest pieces began to soften and lose their structural integrity. But the principle never needed revision, because the principle was not a technique that could become outdated. It was a fact about how heat moves through materials, and facts do not expire. Cora Nyland raised her children in that cabin through 9 more winters, and in every one of them the woodpile lasted longer than any comparable woodpile in the valley, and in every one of them Peter and Aileen slept in a back room with the door open, and in every one of them the stove ticked quietly through the night instead of roaring. And these small domestic facts were the monuments to what she had built. Not dramatic, not heroic, simply true, night after night, winter after winter, for as long as the bark held and the air stayed still. There is something in this story that is worth carrying beyond its particular geography and its particular century. Cora Nyland did not argue with the people who told her she was wrong. She did not explain her reasoning to people who had not asked for it. She did not wait for permission or approval or consensus before she began. She worked. She applied what she knew. She trusted that the winter would demonstrate what conversation could not, and she was right, and the winter did. The thing that made her neighbors uncomfortable was not the method. It was the appearance. The cabin looked wrong. It looked wild, unkempt, abandoned. It looked like a person who had stopped caring about the opinions of the community, and in a small valley where survival depended in part on communal trust and shared standards, a cabin that looked like it had given up on civilization was not merely an aesthetic problem. It was a social one. It suggested that the person inside had priorities that the community could not read, and unreadable priorities are unsettling to people who depend on being able to predict their neighbors. But the appearance was the method. The wildness was the insulation. The thing that looked like decay was the thing that was keeping the heat in and the cold out, and the children warm and the woodpile full. You could not have the warmth without the strangeness, because the strangeness was the bark, and the bark was the container for the still air, and the still air was the insulation, and the insulation was the whole point of everything she had spent her summer collecting and her autumn nailing to the walls of her dead husband's cabin, while the valley watched and named it and shook its collective head. If you recognize something in this, if you have ever built something that looked from the outside like a mistake, then you understand what Cora understood, that the people watching from the road can only see the exterior. They cannot feel the warmth inside. They cannot press their hands to the floor and find it warm in January. They see the bark, and they see the wildness, and they draw their conclusions, and their conclusions are reasonable and confident and wrong, and they will remain wrong until the winner proves otherwise, and the winner will prove otherwise, because the winner does not care what things look like from the road. What are you building that looks wild from the outside? What have you covered your walls with that makes the people passing by slow down and shake their heads? The bark is not the point. The air inside the bark is the point. The gap between what people see and what you know is not a problem to be solved by explanation. It is a season to be waited out. The warmth is already there. The woodpile is already lasting longer than anyone expected. The children are already sleeping with the door open. Press your hand to the work, feel what is there, and let the winter do the rest. If this story spoke to something you are building or protecting or holding on to quietly while the people around you question it, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet found this channel, consider subscribing. There is a story here every day, and some of them are looking for exactly you. This story is a work of fiction. Cora Nyland, Orin Tate, and all other characters and events depicted are entirely invented. The use of bark as exterior insulation on log structures is historically documented across multiple cold climate building traditions. The story is not.